The obelisk stayed silent for centuries. Until the human touched it, the keeper's obelisk stood where it had always stood, rising from the silver sands of threshold like a shard of frozen starlight. For 847 standard cycles, it had been the galaxy's greatest mystery and its most humbling monument. Every species that reached for the stars eventually found their way here, to this neutral world maintained by the Galactic Council, to stand before the crystalline structure and wonder. The obelisk measured 30 meters from base to tip, its surface a seamless expanse of what appeared to be living crystal. Glyphs covered every centimeter, flowing and interweaving in patterns that seemed to shift when observed from different angles. Xenolinguists had spent centuries trying to decode them. Physicists had analyzed the material composition. Psionics had attempted to commune with whatever intelligence might dwell within. Nothing worked. The obelisk simply existed, beautiful and silent, a reminder that some questions remained unanswered even in an age where faster-than-light travel had become routine. The Vexari had discovered it first, back when their civilization was young and still believed they might be alone in the universe. They built the settlement around it, tended it, studied it with religious devotion. When other species arrived, the Vexari welcomed them, believing the obelisk was meant to be shared. The council formed partly because of this place, this shared mystery that reminded everyone how much they didn't know. Doctor. Sarah Chen had read about the obelisk since childhood, back when humanity was still confined to its own solar system. Piecing together the basics of quantum drives from fragments of knowledge, traded with the few species willing to deal with the newcomers. She remembered the grainy images in textbooks, the speculation, the wonder. Now she stood on threshold itself, part of humanity's first official delegation to the Galactic Council, and the reality of the structure took her breath away. Impressive, isn't it? Ambassador Kowalski stood beside her, his formal robes looking uncomfortable in Threshold's warm afternoon. Try not to stare too much. The elder species find it amusing when we act like tourists. We are tourists, technically. We've been in space for barely 200 years. Some of these species have been traveling the stars for millennia. The Vexari, tall and graceful with their crystalline skin that refracted light into rainbows. The Kralix, powerful and militaristic, their segmented armor glinting like beetle shells. The Dalthine, who floated rather than walked, their translucent bodies rippling with bioluminescence. And dozens more, each so different from humanity, and from each other that Sarah felt a familiar surge of wonder at the sheer diversity of life the universe had produced. The ceremony begins in 20 minutes, Kowalski said. Remember the protocols. We approach in the order of ascension to spaceflight. That puts us dead last. We bow at 3 meters distance. We do not touch the obelisk. We do not attempt to communicate with it. We observe for exactly 2 minutes, then we withdraw. Physical contact, electromagnetic pulses, quantum entanglement, telepathic projection. Nothing's worked. The Council decided centuries ago that constant attempts were undignified. Now we simply acknowledge it exists and move on. The idea of standing before the galaxy's greatest artifact and not being allowed to investigate felt wrong somehow. The ceremony proceeded with formal precision. Species after species approached, performed their traditional acknowledgments, and withdrew. The Vexari sang a harmonic sequence. The Kralix offered a recitation of conquest and glory. The Dalthine simply pulsed with light in a pattern Sarah's translator couldn't interpret. Each approach yielded the same result. The obelisk remained unchanged, its glyphs continuing their subtle movements, its crystalline surface reflecting the gathered crowd without offering any response. Finally, humanity's turn arrived. Kowalski led their small delegation forward, Sarah and 3 other scientists following in careful formation. They stopped at the prescribed distance, and Kowalski delivered the speech he'd practiced, welcoming the Council on humanity's behalf and expressing gratitude for their patience with such a young species. Sarah barely heard him. Her attention had fixed on a section of glyphs about 2 meters up the obelisk's face. The symbols there formed a pattern she recognized, or thought she did. It reminded her of something she'd seen in human mathematics, a fractal equation that her grandfather had shown her when she was young. But that was impossible. The obelisk predated human spaceflight by thousands of years. She stepped closer, drawn by curiosity, her scientific training overriding diplomatic protocol. The glyphs seemed to pulse gently, though her instruments showed no change in energy output. The pattern was definitely there, definitely familiar. How could an alien artifact display something that looked like human mathematical notation? Without thinking, Sarah reached out and touched the surface. The universe exploded into light. The obelisk blazed like a captured star, radiance pouring from its crystalline structure in waves that washed over the assembled crowd. Sarah felt the surface warm under her palm, felt vibrations traveling up her arm that weren't quite sound, but weren't quite anything else either. The sensation bypassed her ears entirely and resonated directly in her bones, her teeth, the hollow spaces in her skull. Around her, aliens cried out in shock and wonder. Kowalski was shouting something she couldn't hear over the harmonic frequency that filled the air. The glyphs on the obelisk's surface began rearranging themselves, flowing like water, forming new patterns that seemed to reach out toward Sarah specifically. Then the holographic interface appeared. It materialized in the space between Sarah and the obelisk, a three-dimensional display of symbols and equations and star maps that rotated slowly in the air. Sarah's hand remained pressed to the crystal surface, and when she moved her other hand experimentally, the holographic display responded, rotating to follow her gesture. "What did you do?" Kowalski had reached her side, his face pale with shock. "I don't know," Sarah whispered. "I just touched it." "In 847 cycles," the elder said, her voice barely audible, "the obelisk has never responded to any species, never shown any acknowledgement. And you simply touched it." The holographic display shifted, and a symbol appeared that Sarah understood instinctively meant wait, or observe, or perhaps both. News of the activation spread through Threshold's communication networks within seconds. By the time the initial shock wore off, delegations from every species on the planet were converging on the ceremonial grounds. The Galactic Council called an emergency session. Ships in orbit changed their trajectories to get better sensor readings. And through it all, the obelisk continued to glow, continued to project its mysterious interface, and continued to respond only to Sarah's presence. The Kralix delegation arrived with a full honor guard, their leader striding forward with barely concealed aggression. "This is clearly a matter of galactic security," Commander Vrex announced, his translator rendering his clicks and whistles into flat, authoritative words. "The human must be taken into protective custody for proper study. The obelisk's activation cannot be random. There must be compatibility factors we can identify and replicate. She will not be removed from Threshold. This discovery is too important to leave in the hands of a species that barely understands quantum physics. And I'm not going anywhere until I figure out what this thing wants. You happen to provide the correct input, likely by accident. With proper analysis, we can determine exactly what triggered the response." Mathematical sequences scrolled past, complex and beautiful, and Sarah realized with growing wonder that she could follow them. Not because she was a genius mathematician, but because the patterns made intuitive sense. They reminded her of music theory, of the way her mother had taught her to recognize harmonics and chord progressions. The math wasn't just calculation. It was rhythm, pattern, relationship. She began interacting with the display more confidently, touching symbols that felt right, watching the interface respond and expand. Star maps appeared, showing regions of space she didn't recognize. Biological diagrams that depicted life forms both familiar and utterly alien. And underneath it all, a question that wasn't written in words but that Sarah understood nonetheless. "Can you see the patterns?" "Yes," she whispered to the obelisk. "I can see them." Sarah's mind raced to keep up, her hands moving almost automatically to navigate through layers of data. She was vaguely aware of other scientists crowding around her, their instruments scanning, their voices excited and confused. Over the next several days, Sarah remained at the obelisk, barely sleeping, sustained by the kind of scientific fervor that had driven her through graduate school and into xenoarchaeology in the first place. Other humans tried to interface with the display, but the obelisk only responded to Sarah's touch. Alien scientists attempted their own interactions, but the holographic projection remained stubbornly attuned to human neural patterns specifically. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a neurologist from the human delegation, ran scan after scan of Sarah's brain activity while she worked. On the third day, he pulled her aside during one of her brief rest periods. "I think I know what's happening," he said quietly. The obelisk isn't testing for intelligence or technological achievement. It's testing for a specific type of cognitive processing. The way you're solving these puzzles, recognizing these patterns, it's using parts of your brain that handle both mathematical reasoning and creative pattern recognition simultaneously. It's like the obelisk is looking for a species that thinks in a particular way. Evolutionarily speaking, humans developed unusual cognitive flexibility. We're pattern-seeking machines. We see faces in clouds, hear music in mathematics, find connections between disparate concepts. Most species evolved intelligence along more specialized paths. Better telepathy, better logical processing, better memory. But humans, we're generalists who excel at finding unexpected connections. They were cognitive puzzles, designed to be solved by a mind that could think both analytically and creatively, that could see mathematical relationships as artistic patterns and vice versa. The precursors, whoever they'd been, had been looking for a specific kind of intelligence, a specific way of perceiving reality. And humanity, messy and creative and strange as it was, happened to fit the criteria. On the seventh day, the obelisk projected something new. A three-dimensional star map with a single coordinate pulsing like a heartbeat deep in uncharted space. Sarah zoomed in and the display showed her a massive structure orbiting a dying star, clearly artificial, incomprehensibly vast. Then came images that made her heart race. Biospheres containing ecosystems, libraries filled with data, museums of extinct civilizations. The structure wasn't a weapon or a power source. It was a preservation, a collection, a memory of everything the precursors had encountered before they vanished. Sarah reached out to touch the coordinate, to learn more, when alarms began blaring throughout the ceremonial grounds. She turned to see Krallick's soldiers streaming through the entrances, weapons drawn, moving with military precision. Commander Vrex stood at their head, his armor gleaming. "By authority of the Krallick's empire, this site is now under our protection," Vrex announced. "Doctor Chen, you will accompany us for proper study. The obelisk's secrets are too valuable to risk on diplomatic niceties." The obelisk's light intensified, and suddenly Sarah felt something happening, something downloading directly into her consciousness. Coordinates, instructions, a purpose that felt both ancient and urgent. The last thing she saw before the tranquilizer dart hit her neck was the obelisk projecting one final message. The glyphs rearranged themselves into human script, clear and unmistakable. Only the gardeners may enter. Then darkness claimed her, and the obelisk's light dimmed to its previous silent state, leaving the galaxy to wonder what humanity had awakened and what it might cost them all to find out. Sarah woke to the familiar hum of human ship engines, a sound so different from the crystalline harmonics of the obelisk that for a moment she thought the entire experience had been a dream. Then the memories flooded back and she sat up too quickly, her head spinning from the aftereffects of the tranquilizer. "Easy there, Doc." Commander James Okonkwo stood beside her medical bay bed, his dark face creased with concern. "You've been out for 18 hours. We got you off threshold just before the Krallics could leave orbit with you. The Council is going to think we kidnapped ourselves. The diplomatic incident alone could get humanity expelled from galactic society. Half the Council wants humanity protected as the key to understanding the precursors. The other half wants us contained as a potential threat. The Krallics are mobilizing their fleet, claiming we stole precursor secrets. And you're at the center of all of it." The coordinates were there, clear as a memory, along with instructions she couldn't quite put into words yet but understood on an instinctive level. "I know where we need to go," she said quietly. "The obelisk showed me. There's a structure, something the precursors left behind. The coordinates are in my head. We pulled the trajectory data from the scans we took while you were interfacing with the obelisk." Threnix, a Vexari scholar she'd met briefly on Threshold, stood near the viewport, his crystalline form refracting the ship's lights into gentle rainbows. A Dalthine engineer named Whisper floated near the ceiling, her bioluminescent body pulsing with what Sarah had learned was curiosity. And most surprisingly, a Krallick's officer in non-military clothing sat at the table, her mandibles moving in what might have been anxiety. "Doctor Chen," Threnix spoke first, his translated voice carrying the musical quality of Vexari's speech. "I apologize for the informality of our meeting, but I couldn't let political posturing prevent the pursuit of knowledge. When your people reached out, offering passage to whatever the obelisk revealed, I accepted immediately. I have resigned my commission rather than participate in my empire's attempt to monopolize precursor technology. What Commander Vrex ordered was against every principle of scientific inquiry. If you'll have me, I wish to help." The precursors called it the gardener's mind. It's a way of processing information that combines analytical reasoning with creative pattern recognition. Humans happen to have evolved brains that work this way, but that doesn't make us better. It just makes us compatible with their systems. This is what they called the greenhouse. It's not a weapon or a power source. It's a library, a museum, a preservation of everything the precursors encountered before they disappeared. Millions of biospheres containing extinct ecosystems. Data archives of civilizations that no longer exist. Art, music, literature, science from species that died out thousands of years ago. The scientific value would be immeasurable. Knowledge without wisdom can be dangerous. They weren't looking for the smartest species or the strongest. They were looking for species capable of being caretakers, beings who could preserve and protect without exploiting. The gardener's mind isn't just about pattern recognition. It's about seeing connections between things, understanding that diversity has value, that different perspectives can work together. During that time, Sarah worked with the assembled scientists to prepare for whatever they might find. She also discovered that other humans could learn to interface with precursor technology once she showed them how. It wasn't about inherent ability, but about approach, about letting their minds make unexpected connections rather than following rigid logical paths. Dr. Tanaka spent hours running cognitive tests, comparing human neural patterns with those of other species. "It's fascinating," he explained during one of their sessions. "Most species evolved intelligence to solve specific environmental challenges. Vexari developed enhanced memory and pattern retention for navigating their crystalline forests. Kralix evolved tactical processing for coordinating swarm behaviors. Dalthine have incredible mathematical abilities for managing their three-dimensional aquatic environments. But humans, we're evolutionary wildcards. Our intelligence developed from being adaptable generalists who had to survive in constantly changing conditions. That looks at clouds and sees faces. That creates art inspired by scientific principles and science inspired by artistic vision. The precursors were looking for that specific kind of cognitive flexibility, because it's what they had themselves. The greenhouse existed in a stable orbit around a red dwarf star, a structure so vast it looked like a small planet. Its surface was smooth and reflective, covered in the same kind of living crystal as the obelisk. As they approached, sections of the surface began to glow with welcoming light. "We're being scanned," Whisper reported from her engineering station. "Multiple frequencies, including some I've never seen before, but there's no hostile intent in the signal patterns. It feels more like a greeting. I think it's expecting us." They landed on a platform that adjusted itself to perfectly fit their vessel, and when they disembarked, the artificial gravity felt exactly like Earth normal despite being inside an alien megastructure. The interior was breathtaking. Corridors of living crystal branched in all directions, their walls displaying holographic representations of the contents they led to. Sarah could see ecosystems preserved in stasis, libraries of crystallized data, museums containing artifacts from civilizations that had vanished millennia ago. It was everything the obelisk had promised and more. Then the AI activated. It didn't have a physical form, but Sarah felt its presence like a warm pressure in her mind. When it spoke, the words appeared simultaneously in every language represented by their group, projected on the crystal walls in a display that was both technological and somehow organic. "Welcome, gardeners. I am the Greenhouse Archive, created by the precursors to preserve the legacy of galactic life. You have been tested and found compatible. Now you must choose." The precursors knew their time was ending. They created the greenhouse to ensure that knowledge would survive, that the voices of extinct species would not be lost forever. But preservation requires protection. The greenhouse can only be activated fully by beings capable of understanding its purpose. You can claim this legacy for your species, become its sole guardians, or you can choose a different path. She could feel the weight of the decision, the implications rippling outward. If humanity claimed the greenhouse for themselves, they would gain access to technology and knowledge far beyond their current understanding. They could become the most powerful species in the galaxy overnight, but they would also become targets, and worse, they would be betraying the very principles the precursors had been testing for. "What's the alternative?" she asked the AI. "Share the burden." The greenhouse was never meant for one species alone. The precursors hoped that eventually many species would develop the gardener's mind. You are the first, but you need not be the only. Can other species learn what you've learned, Sarah? Can we develop this way of thinking? The obelisk wasn't testing for something we're born with. It was testing for a way of thinking that humanity happened to develop naturally. But thinking can be taught, perspectives can be shared. Sarah activated her communication link, broadcasting on all frequencies, sending the message not just to their ship, but to every vessel within range, to Threshold, to the Council, even to the approaching Kralix fleet. "This is Dr. Sarah Chen to all galactic civilizations. I'm broadcasting from a precursor structure called the greenhouse. It's a preservation of extinct life and knowledge, created by beings who value diversity and cooperation above all else. The structure responds to what the precursors called the gardener's mind, a way of thinking that combines creativity with analysis, that sees connections between different fields of knowledge. Humanity can activate it, but we don't want to control it alone. It's not about being human. It's about being willing to see the universe from multiple perspectives, to value preservation over exploitation, to understand that the best solutions come from diverse thinking." Ships began arriving within hours, representatives from dozens of species eager to learn. The Dalthine engineer Whisper was the first non-human to successfully interface with a secondary control station, her mathematical mind adapting to the creative pattern recognition required. Then Threnix succeeded, his crystalline biology giving him an advantage in perceiving the holographic interfaces. Even Krelth, the Kralix science officer, managed to activate a terminal after 3 days of practice, her tactical processing adapting to think in broader, more connected patterns. The Kralix fleet arrived expecting to find humans claiming precursor technology for themselves. Instead, they found the greenhouse surrounded by ships from across the galaxy, all working together. Admiral Vraxis, Commander Vrex's superior, faced a choice: attack this unprecedented coalition or acknowledge that perhaps the humans had understood something his empire had missed. Sarah watched from the greenhouse's command center as the Kralix fleet took up positions around the structure. The tension was palpable. Then Krelth, the defector science officer, sent a message on a private Kralix channel. Sarah couldn't understand the language, but she saw the effect. Several Kralix ships broke formation, moving to join the civilian vessels. More followed. Within an hour, half of Vraxis's fleet had effectively mutinied in favor of scientific cooperation over military dominance. The admiral himself came aboard the greenhouse 3 days later, his armor removed, approaching Sarah with something that looked like humility. "We Kralix built our entire civilization on strength and conquest. We believed the precursors were warriors like us, that their artifacts would grant military supremacy. We were wrong. They valued what could be preserved, not what could be controlled. There's a place for the Kralix here if you want it. Your tactical thinking could be valuable in protecting the greenhouse, in coordinating its defense." Humanity was granted the title of First Gardener, not as rulers, but as guides who could teach others to interface with precursor technology. A permanent research station was established, staffed by scientists from every species in the Council and several that weren't yet members. Sarah remained as the greenhouse's chief curator, working with an ever-growing team to catalog and study the millions of preserved biospheres and data archives. She discovered extinct civilizations that had created music from mathematics, species that had written poetry in genetic code, entire cultures that had built their societies around principles humanity was only beginning to understand. 6 months after the greenhouse's activation, Sarah stood in the Obelisk chamber back on Threshold. The ceremonial grounds were packed with beings from across the galaxy, all come to learn the techniques of gardener thinking. The obelisk glowed brightly now, responding to dozens of different species as they learned to approach it not with reverence or scientific detachment alone, but with the kind of curious, creative, connected thinking the precursors had valued. A young Kralik student successfully activated a glyph sequence for the first time, her mandibles clicking with excitement. Sarah felt a surge of pride watching the young being discover what humanity had stumbled upon. This was what the precursors had hoped for. Not one species claiming superiority, but many species learning from each other, preserving knowledge together, cultivating the diversity that made the galaxy rich and strange and wonderful. Commander Okonkwo found her watching the crowd. You could have claimed all of this for humanity, made us the most powerful species in the galaxy. They were looking for beings who understood that the best gardens grow when many hands tend them, when different perspectives work together. She smiled. Humanity's gift to the galaxy wasn't that we could activate the obelisk. It was showing everyone else that they could too, if they were willing to think differently. All across Threshold, beings from worlds that had been suspicious or competitive were now working side by side, teaching and learning from each other. The greenhouse orbited in distant space, its vast libraries open to all who approached with curiosity and respect rather than conquest. Humanity had touched the obelisk and awakened something ancient. But more importantly, they had reminded the galaxy of something it had forgotten, that the universe was too vast and wonderful for any one species to understand alone, and that the greatest legacy anyone could leave was teaching others to see beauty in patterns they'd never noticed before. The precursors were gone, but their garden was thriving at last, tended by many hands and minds, growing wild and diverse and magnificent under the care of those who had finally learned to be gardeners. 3 years had passed since the greenhouse opened its doors to the galaxy, and Sarah Chen barely recognized the universe she now lived in. The changes hadn't been dramatic or sudden, but they had been profound, like watching a garden slowly transform through patient cultivation. The Galactic Council had restructured itself around principles of shared knowledge rather than political dominance. Species that had barely spoken to each other for centuries now collaborated on research projects. And at the heart of it all, the greenhouse continued to reveal its secrets to those willing to learn its language. Sarah walked through one of the biodome chambers, a vast space containing a perfectly preserved ecosystem from a species called the Harmonics, who had gone extinct 2,000 years before the Vexari had even developed spaceflight. The trees here didn't photosynthesize light but sound, their crystalline leaves chiming softly in response to air currents. A Kralix botanist named Thex worked nearby, carefully cataloging each species of plant, his massive claws surprisingly gentle as he collected samples for analysis. "The root structures are fascinating," Thex said when he noticed Sarah approaching. "They form networks that share nutrients based on harmonic resonance rather than chemical signals. I've been working with a human musician named Dr. Patel to understand the patterns. She hears relationships in the frequencies that my instruments can measure, but my mind couldn't recognize on its own." The greenhouse had changed him, changed all of them really. "Have you made progress on reproducing the ecosystem?" "It's mostly desert now, but with the genetic samples from the greenhouse and cooperation from Dalthine climate engineers, Vexari geneticists, and human ecologists, we think we can bring back at least a portion of what was lost." The restoration projects had become one of the greenhouse's most important functions. The precursors hadn't just preserved extinct ecosystems for study. They'd stored everything needed to potentially restore them, to give vanished species a second chance at existence. It was painstaking work that required expertise from multiple species, and it had become the ultimate expression of what the precursors had hoped to teach. Sarah's communication device chirped, and Threnix's holographic form appeared above her wrist. The Vexari scholar looked excited, his crystalline features glowing brighter than usual. "Sarah, you need to come to Archive 7 immediately. We've found something in the precursors' personal records." Something about why they chose the criteria they did for Gardner's mind. Threnix had assembled a team of linguists and historians from 6 different species, all working to piece together the story the ancient records told. "The precursors weren't the first gardeners," Threnix explained, gesturing to a display that showed an even older civilization. They inherited the greenhouse from another species, one that had inherited it from someone before them. The chain goes back at least 7 cycles of galactic civilization, maybe more. Each time a spacefaring culture reached a certain level of development, they faced a choice: use their knowledge to dominate or to preserve. And each time, the test remained the same. Not because one type of thinking is superior, but because this specific cognitive pattern, the gardener's mind, is what makes beings choose preservation over exploitation. It's the ability to see yourself as part of a larger pattern rather than the center of everything. Those that develop technology without developing this broader perspective eventually destroy themselves or stagnate. But those that learn to think as gardeners, to value diversity and cooperation, they're the ones who survive long enough to pass the knowledge forward. They evolved beyond the need for physical form, or they left the galaxy, or something else happened to them naturally. And before they went, they made sure the greenhouse would find new caretakers. And now we have to decide what that means for us. The Great Assembly Chamber, usually used for research presentations, was converted into a meeting space where hundreds of beings could gather. Ambassador Kowalski, who had been promoted to humanity's primary representative to the Council, stood beside Sarah as the session began. 3 years ago, I was worried about maintaining diplomatic protocols, he said quietly. Now we're discussing the philosophical future of galactic civilization. I'm not sure I'm qualified for this. The precursors didn't leave instructions because there is no perfect answer. Each generation of gardeners has to figure it out for themselves. The greatest disagreement came from the Kralix delegation, led by Admiral Vraxis himself. The old warrior had undergone a remarkable transformation over the past years, learning to interface with precursor technology and dedicating himself to understanding rather than conquering. But he still carried the weight of his species' martial history. "We Kralix are struggling," Vraxis admitted during one session, his translated voice carrying a vulnerability that would have been unthinkable years ago. "Our entire culture was built on strength and hierarchy. Young Kralix are learning gardener thinking in schools now, interfacing with precursor archives, and they're questioning everything their ancestors believed. Is this progress, or are we losing our identity?" "Identity isn't fixed, Admiral. The Kralix of 1,000 years ago would barely recognize the Kralix of your generation. We've always changed, always adapted. The question isn't whether we'll remain Kralix, but what kind of Kralix we choose to become. Humanity is learning that our creative, chaotic approach to problems isn't the only valid method. The Vexari are discovering that perfect memory and preservation can coexist with experimentation and change. The Dalthine are finding that their mathematical precision can be enhanced by intuitive leaps. We're all becoming something new while keeping what made us who we are. It wasn't a law or a treaty, but a shared commitment. Every species would maintain its unique perspective and culture while learning to think in the broader patterns that the precursors had valued. The greenhouse would remain neutral territory, open to all, governed by a rotating council of gardeners from every participating civilization. But the most important part of the covenant was what it said about the future. When the current species eventually evolved beyond their need for the greenhouse, or when they faced their own inevitable endings, they would ensure that new voices could join the garden. The cycle would continue, knowledge would be preserved, and the diversity of galactic life would remain protected. Sarah found herself thinking about cycles and gardens a lot in the months that followed. She had discovered something unexpected in one of the deeper archive levels, a section that had only opened after multiple species had successfully interfaced with its systems together. It contained records of the precursors' final days, and the truth was both sadder and more beautiful than anyone had imagined. The precursors hadn't disappeared mysteriously or ascended to higher dimensions. They had simply reached the end of their time as a biological species. Their sun had been dying, and rather than abandon their work or try to flee, they had chosen to complete the greenhouse, to ensure their knowledge would survive even if they didn't. The last precursor, an individual whose name translated roughly as Final Gardener, had written a message that Sarah read with tears in her eyes. "We hope that someday, beings will find this place and understand what we tried to preserve. Not just the biology and the technology, but the idea that diversity has value, that different perspectives working together create something greater than any one viewpoint alone. We hope they will become gardeners not because we commanded it, but because they choose it. And when their time comes, as all times must end, we hope they will pass this gift forward to others who will make it their own. They weren't just maintaining what the precursors had built. They were continuing a tradition that might stretch back to the beginning of complex life in the galaxy, a chain of civilizations choosing to preserve rather than destroy, to nurture rather than consume. The practical applications of this philosophy spread throughout known space. The Kralix Empire restructured its military as a protection force for restoration projects and exploration missions. The Vexari began teaching their perfect memory techniques to other species while learning human creative problem-solving methods. The Dalthine shared their mathematical models for sustainable development with civilizations just beginning their industrial ages. And humanity, still young and sometimes chaotic, served as enthusiastic connectors, finding unexpected relationships between different species approaches and helping translate concepts across cultural divides. 5 years after first touching the obelisk, Sarah stood in the same ceremonial gardens on Threshold where everything had begun. The grounds had been expanded significantly, with learning centers and cultural exchange facilities built in harmony with the landscape. The obelisk still rose from the silver sands, but now it was surrounded by dozens of smaller teaching stations where beings of all ages learned to think in gardener patterns. A young human girl, perhaps 10 years old, approached the obelisk under the supervision of her Vexari teacher. The child placed her hand on the surface with confident curiosity, and the structure responded immediately, glowing with welcoming light. But unlike 5 years ago, this wasn't shocking or mysterious anymore. It was normal, expected, a rite of passage that thousands of young beings from dozens of species experienced as part of their education. Commander Okonkwo, now Admiral, joined Sarah at her observation point. Hard to believe how much has changed. When we rescued you from the Kralix, I thought we'd started a war. Instead, we started a renaissance. The real change came from everyone choosing to learn from it rather than fight over it. But we learned just as much as we taught. Vexari patience, Dalthine precision, Kralix discipline, all of it has made humanity better too. That's the real lesson of the greenhouse. We're all incomplete on our own. It's the diversity that makes us strong. Nearby, a group of mixed-species students worked together on a problem projection, their different cognitive approaches combining to find solutions none could have reached alone. Threnix appeared, approaching with his characteristic grace. The Deep Archive team has finished translating another section of precursor records. They found plans, Sarah. Instructions for building new obelisks, for expanding the greenhouse, for carrying the garden to other galaxies when we're ready. Other galaxies, they expected us to spread this across the universe. It's always a choice, never a command. Researchers made breakthroughs by combining approaches that had seemed incompatible. Artists created works that blended sensibilities from across the galaxy into something entirely new. This was what the precursors had really preserved. Not just old knowledge, but the potential for continuous growth and change. They had planted seeds and trusted that whoever found them would have the wisdom to let them flourish rather than hoarding them or letting them wither. "When do you think we'll be ready?" Sarah asked. "To build new obelisks to expand to other galaxies." When cooperation becomes natural rather than exceptional, when the idea of preserving diversity isn't a political statement but simply how we approach existence. He paused, his translated voice carrying warmth. "Perhaps in another generation, perhaps in 10. The precursors didn't set a timeline because gardens grow at their own pace. She read it again, thinking about cycles and choices, about how each civilization added its own chapter to a story that might never end. The precursors had touched their obelisk equivalent and learned from someone before them. Now humanity and its fellow species were learning the same lessons, adapting them to their own time and circumstances. Someday, perhaps millennia from now, other beings would find what they had built and make their own choices about what to preserve and what to change. Sarah added her own message to the archive, a note for whoever might read it in some distant future. "We weren't perfect gardeners. We made mistakes, had conflicts, struggled to understand each other. But we chose to keep trying to value our differences, to build something together that none of us could have created alone. The garden is yours now. Make it flourish in ways we never imagined. Then she looked out at the vast greenhouse stretching around her, at the millions of preserved biospheres and the thousands of living researchers working to understand them, and felt profoundly grateful to be part of something so much larger than herself. The obelisk had stayed silent for centuries until a human touched it, but that touch hadn't been an ending. It had been a beginning, a seed sprouting after a long winter, growing into something beautiful and strange and utterly unpredictable. The galaxy had become a garden at last, tended by many hands, flourishing with diversity, and the precursor's ancient hope had finally taken root in fertile ground. 10 years after Sarah Chen first touched the obelisk, the galaxy had transformed in ways that even the most optimistic projections hadn't predicted. The greenhouse had become more than a research facility or a museum of extinct civilizations. It had evolved into a living symbol of what cooperative intelligence could achieve, a place where the boundaries between species blurred in the pursuit of shared understanding. Sarah stood in what had become known as the Genesis Lab, watching a team of researchers from 7 different species work on their most ambitious project yet. They were attempting to revive not just an ecosystem, but an entire extinct civilization, using genetic samples, cultural archives, and environmental data preserved by the precursors. The species was called the Melodians, beings who had experienced reality primarily through sound, and had built a civilization around acoustic engineering that made modern technology look primitive by comparison. Dr. Yuki Tanaka monitored the neural development tanks where the first Melodians in 3,000 years were growing. "The ethical implications still keep me awake at night," he admitted to Sarah. "We're essentially playing at being gods, bringing back a species that nature or circumstance eliminated." They preserved them with revival protocols, with detailed instructions on how to give them a second chance. They wanted us to have this choice. The question isn't whether we can revive them, but whether we should. And if we do, what responsibility do we have to them? They'll wake into a galaxy completely different from the one they knew. We would have used precursor technology to conquer. But the greenhouse taught us that true strength means having power and choosing not to abuse it. Reviving the Melodians isn't about showing what we can do. It's about honoring what was lost and giving it a chance to grow again. Some species worried about the psychological impact on revived beings, waking to find their entire civilization existed only in archives. Others argued that consciousness was precious and that any opportunity to restore it should be taken. Humanity, still young and idealistic, had been among the strongest advocates for revival, though even among humans the opinions were divided. In the end, they had decided to proceed with careful safeguards. The first generation of Melodians would be raised with full knowledge of their situation, educated by beings from multiple species who had studied Melodian culture extensively. They would be given a choice about whether to rebuild their civilization or integrate into existing ones. And most importantly, they would never be alone. The greenhouse had become home to representatives from over 200 species, and the Melodians would wake into a galaxy that had learned to value diversity above all else. Sarah received a message on her communication device and felt her heart skip. The signal was from a deep space probe that had been sent out 5 years ago, carrying a newly constructed obelisk to a distant star system where preliminary scans had detected signs of emerging intelligent life. The probe had just activated, which meant something had touched the new obelisk. She rushed to the communications center where a crowd had already gathered. The main display showed grainy images from the probe's cameras, and what Sarah saw made her smile with wonder. The beings were insectoid, about half the size of humans, with 6 limbs and compound eyes that reflected light in spectacular patterns. They had built simple structures around the obelisk, clearly treating it with reverence, and one of them had apparently made contact. The obelisk was glowing, responding to the touch just as the original had responded to Sarah a decade ago. Holographic interfaces were appearing, and the insectoid being was interacting with them, their multiple limbs moving in complex patterns that suggested they were solving the cognitive puzzles with ease. "They have it," Threnix said softly, appearing beside Sarah. "The gardener's mind. Their neural structure is completely different from any species we know, but they think in the right patterns. Offer them membership in the council. We don't even know if they've developed space travel yet. And when they're ready, when they reach out to the stars on their own, we'll be here to welcome them. But we don't interfere. We don't push our timeline onto them. This is the first species to find an obelisk that we placed. We're not just gardeners anymore. We're becoming precursors ourselves, passing forward what was given to us. For 10 years, they had focused on learning from what the precursors left behind, on understanding and preserving and growing. But now they were actively expanding the garden, planting new seeds in distant soil, trusting that others would nurture them. Over the following months, the observation of the insectoid species, whom they began calling the chorus based on their apparent communication through rhythmic vibrations, became one of the greenhouse's primary focuses. Teams of xenobiologists, linguists, and sociologists studied every scrap of data the probe sent back, piecing together the chorus's culture and development. What they discovered was both familiar and utterly alien. The chorus had no concept of individual identity as most species understood it. They thought and acted in coordinated groups, their consciousness somehow distributed across multiple bodies while remaining distinct from a hive mind. When one chorus touched the obelisk, dozens of others nearby began exhibiting the same understanding simultaneously, as if knowledge flowed between them through their vibrational communication. Dr. Amara Osai, who had become the greenhouse's chief sociologist, found the implications fascinating. Every species we know has some form of individual consciousness, even if they value collective action. But the chorus might be showing us a completely different model of sapience. They're individuals when they need to be and collective when that serves better. It's cognitive flexibility taken to an extreme we never imagined. If the gardener's mind could manifest in such radically different forms of consciousness, what did that say about the nature of intelligence itself? Were there other patterns of thinking that could serve the same purpose, other ways of being that could tend the garden effectively? Sarah found herself spending long hours in the precursor archives, searching for insights. She discovered records of species the precursors had encountered who thought in ways that seemed incomprehensible at first, but had eventually been recognized as valid forms of intelligence. There were beings who experienced time nonlinearly, making decisions based on outcomes they had already witnessed from their perspective. Others who existed as colonial organisms, each cell capable of independent thought but functioning as part of a greater whole. And some who communicated through alterations to quantum states, their thoughts literally entangled across space and time. The diversity was staggering, and it reinforced a lesson Sarah had learned over and over during her decade at the greenhouse. The universe was far stranger and more wonderful than any single perspective could comprehend. The gardener's mind wasn't about thinking like humans or like any other specific species. It was about recognizing that there were infinite valid ways to understand reality, and that preserving that diversity was the highest calling any civilization could embrace. The first Melodian reached full consciousness on a morning when the greenhouse's artificial sun was just beginning its daily cycle. The creature, given the name Harmony by the revival team, opened sensory organs that could perceive acoustic frequencies far beyond what most species could hear. The world they woke to must have been overwhelming, a cacophony of sounds from hundreds of different life forms all existing in close proximity. Sarah was there, along with Thex, Prism, and a carefully selected group of caregivers who had trained for this moment. They had prepared acoustic environments based on Melodian preferences, created sound-damping chambers where Harmony could retreat if overwhelmed, and studied every scrap of Melodian child-rearing practices preserved in the archives. Harmony's first sounds were tentative, soft whistles and clicks that seemed to be testing the acoustic properties of the space around them. Then, as awareness grew, the sounds became more complex, forming patterns that the linguistic AI identified as questions. Where am I? What am I? Who are you? The caregivers responded in carefully modulated tones, using acoustic translation technology that converted their speech into frequencies Harmony could naturally process. They explained, as gently as possible, that Harmony was the first of their species to live in 3,000 years, that they were being given a chance their entire civilization had been denied by whatever catastrophe had eliminated them. Harmony's response surprised everyone. Instead of fear or confusion, the Melodian produced a sound that the AI translated as curiosity mixed with gratitude. They asked about the others they could sense growing in nearby tanks, about the different species in the room, about the greenhouse itself. And when they learned about the precursors and the chain of civilizations that had chosen preservation over extinction, Harmony created a sound sculpture, a complex acoustic pattern that hung in the air like music, expressing emotions that words couldn't capture. "They understand," Prism said softly, her crystalline body resonating with harmonics from Harmony's sound sculpture. "Not just intellectually, but fundamentally. They're already thinking like a gardener." They brought perspectives and abilities that enriched the research in unexpected ways. Their natural perception of sound waves allowed them to detect structural stresses in the greenhouse's crystalline architecture that other species' instruments had missed. Their cultural emphasis on harmony led them to develop new conflict resolution protocols that became adopted throughout the Council. And their artistic expressions, sound sculptures that could last for hours and incorporate contributions from multiple creators, became a new form of cross-species collaboration that everyone could participate in. Sarah watched a mixed group of researchers work together on a restoration project for another extinct ecosystem. A human ecologist, a Kralix botanist, two Dalthine climate engineers, a Vexari geneticist, a Melodian acoustic specialist, and a chorus coordinator whose individual components moved in perfect synchronization. They communicated through a mixture of verbal language, holographic displays, sound patterns, and vibrational signals, each contributing their unique perspective to solve problems that would have been impossible for any single species alone. This was the garden in full bloom, she realized. Not the carefully controlled environment that the precursors had left behind, but something wild and chaotic and beautiful that had grown from those seeds. Every species added something unique, and the whole became greater than any of its parts. Ambassador Kowalski found her watching the team work. "The Council wants to discuss the next phase. We've identified 3 more solar systems with emerging intelligent life. The engineering teams say they can build obelisks for all of them within 5 years. Assuming they develop gardener consciousness naturally or choose to learn it." But the precursors believed that any species capable of reaching for the stars had the potential to think beyond themselves. And after watching the chorus and the Melodians, after seeing how many different forms intelligence can take, I believe it too. That evening, Sarah returned to her quarters and pulled up the message she had written years ago, the one sealed in the deep archives for future. "Gardeners to find." She added a new entry, updating the record with everything they had learned and accomplished. "The garden grows beyond our wildest dreams. Species we revived have become teachers. Beings we thought incomprehensible have become friends. Every day brings new discoveries, new perspectives, new ways of understanding what it means to think and feel and exist. We're building obelisks for species we haven't even met yet, trusting that they'll add their voices to this grand conversation. If you're reading this, it means the cycle has continued. You've inherited something precious, but don't let that make you afraid to change it. The precursors didn't create a perfect system. They created a beginning. Each generation of gardeners makes the garden their own, plants new varieties, tends what needs tending, and lets some things grow wild. That's not corruption of their vision. That's exactly what they hoped would happen. The Melodians were composing acoustic maps of the galaxy, finding patterns in stellar formations that other species had never noticed. And countless other beings, on worlds scattered throughout the galaxy, were living their lives without knowing that ancient civilizations had left gifts waiting for them to discover. The obelisk on Threshold still stood where it had always stood, but now it was just one of dozens being prepared, a network of invitations spreading across the stars. Each one was a question asked of whoever would find it. Can you see the patterns? Can you think beyond yourself? Will you choose to preserve and nurture rather than dominate and consume? And with each species that answered yes, with each new voice added to the chorus of gardener consciousness, the galaxy became a little more diverse, a little more resilient, a little more alive with possibility. Sarah had touched the obelisk a decade ago out of simple curiosity, never imagining where that moment would lead. Now she understood that her touch had been just one small part of an infinite cycle, a single note in a symphony that had been playing since the first beings chose cooperation over conquest. The music would continue long after she was gone, evolving and changing with each new species that learned to hear it and add their own unique voice. The garden was growing, wild and beautiful and strange, tended by many hands across the stars. And somewhere in the distant future, other beings would inherit what they had built, make it their own, and pass it forward once again. The cycle would continue because each generation chose to make it continue, because they recognized that the greatest legacy anyone could leave was teaching others to see beauty in diversity, and to preserve what made the universe wonderfully, gloriously, impossibly alive.